Conversations, episode 12. Whether you are here for the first time or you are a returning listener, welcome back or welcome in. Very happy to have you either way, and we appreciate your support and listenership. If you are a first-time listener or you're just somebody who hasn't done so yet, be sure to give us a like, give us a subscribe on the various platforms that we are streaming on. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and if there is something that we are on that you would prefer to listen to, or that we're not on, please let us know, and we'll do our best to get on that as quickly as possible. We're on all the major social networks: Facebook, X at KBEX_ATC, Instagram at cornversationspod. And if you want to interact with us in any of those ways, feel free to do so. But we also have a dedicated mailbag. That's cornversationspod@gmail.com. Be sure to send us any of your comments, any of your questions that you want to hear heard on a future episode. The interaction that we have with the guests is really what makes this show fun for me to do, fun for our guests to come on and do, and that's what keeps it going in the future. So appreciate all of that support. Remember, like, subscribe, and if you're interested, go check out some of the things that we've been teasing as far as merch is concerned. If we get enough support on that, I would be happy to put together an initial run that people can take from. We've got an interesting week. The last couple of weeks on Conversations, we have had a guest, which is my favorite part of doing this show, is having those guys on. This week is not one of those shows. We're back to a KBEX solo effort here, but hopefully I've got a couple of entertaining topics that'll keep you guys engaged and at the very least get you guys commenting so that we can get the conversation flowing offline here. I was off the grid last week, so didn't have an opportunity to watch a ton of college football. Did miss some crazy games, especially that South Carolina-Texas A&M game. Caught the highlights there, but I really don't think that it did justice to how crazy that comeback actually was to the Aggies. But I'm not going to focus too much on the results of last week, and we're actually going to take a little bit of a deviation from what we've been covering the last few episodes here, which has been primarily college football. I'm going to talk new leagues, and it'll be something probably that sounds like it's coming out of left field, but I'll explain why, and then we will briefly dive back into college football. For the second week in a row, we've got some coach speak that I think is just interesting to come from this particular individual. So we will end the show with that, given that there are no current mailbag questions for me to answer. So I'll say it for the third time in the first 3 minutes of the show. If you guys have questions that you want answered, make sure you hit that mailbag hard. We also take a look at all the comments on the socials and the listener platforms to see what type of interaction we get from you guys. So yeah, the first topic here, I teased a new league, and I'm not talking about anything in one of the 4 major sports. I'm actually talking about a new league in professional baseball, specifically women's professional baseball. And you may be thinking to yourself, hey, that's kind of out of left field. Why are we talking about this? I've never even heard that this is a thing. Well, when I started the podcast, I was asked by my wife. She said, what are you going to focus on here? And I said, well, I'm going to focus on basically anything that is interesting to me. And interesting to me can span pretty much anything as far as the sports world is concerned. And she said, well, I like your take on things like women's sports, for example. Or could that be something that you might focus on? And while I never really promised to focus on that, because I don't really think that that's an area that I want to necessarily narrow my scope into, it is something that I'm certainly willing to talk about given the right topic. And this new professional baseball league for women, which is known as the Women's Professional Baseball League, is something that I think is interesting enough to talk about. So the reason that I'm bringing it up this week is that earlier in the week, the inaugural draft for the Women's Professional Baseball League was conducted. And just to give a little bit of background as to what this league is. Next season will be their inaugural season. They're going to start in the summer of 2026. It is the first American professional baseball league for women since the Ladies League Baseball, which lasted just a couple of seasons in the late 90s. And prior to that, the leagues that existed for women were the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, which is probably the most well-known of them. It is the league that the movie A League of Their Own is based on. And beyond that, there were a couple of, call it copycat leagues or leagues that tried to build on that success that occurred in the 1940s and 1950s. But it has been almost 30 years since we've had any professional baseball for women, and really it's been half a century since we've had any of them that have made any particular waves as far as sports are concerned. For me, the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League really does hold some historical lore, if you will, in the game of baseball. Number one, it's got a movie about it, but number two, the reason behind why it was created in the first place is probably the most interesting point to talk about with it, which is, of course, that we were in the middle of World War II, and there were not enough of the professional baseball players from the MLB to keep that league going, and so they needed something essentially to create a level of entertainment for the people back home. And so, I don't want to go too deeply into the history of the AAGP, but if you haven't seen the movie, go and watch that. It's a mostly fictionalized version of the events that occurred, but it'll give you a nice flavor for the reason why behind that league and why it did actually garner some real attention in the country when it was being played. But back to the WPBL. This is a league that was co-founded by Justine Siegel and Keith Stein. And Justine Siegel is an interesting name because she was actually the first female to be a batting practice pitcher in Major League Baseball. So she's somebody who has spent her life around the game. She's gotten herself to a very high level as far as professional baseball is concerned, having worked for the pro teams. And now she's going off on her own, and she's created a league here that is meant to establish a path for professionalism for college and amateur players, female players, for baseball. So, before I go into maybe some challenges here with this league, you got to congratulate her for doing this, because this is not getting the backing of Major League Baseball. They're doing this basically on their own. They see some value, some opportunity based on some of the growth that we've seen in other women's sports here over the past several years, namely the WNBA, but also the NWSL when it comes to women's soccer. And they're going to take their shot. They're going to see whether or not this planned 4-team league that's going to be played at a neutral site during the summer has an opportunity to stick with the American viewer. And, that's kind of where I then deviate and I say, okay, well, why? Why would the American viewer watch this? But before we even get there, maybe we ask, why do we need a league specifically for women when it comes to baseball? And to help drive home my challenge here, I want to kind of look at the other major American pro sports and look at whether or not there's opportunity for women to break into one of those leagues, given that they were talented enough to do so. So we're talking American football, basketball, hockey, and baseball for American major pro sports. I think when you look at those first three, American football, the NFL, hockey, the NHL, and basketball, the NBA, the thing that really limits, I think, the possibility that we would ever see a female break into one of those leagues is the major gap in physical vigor that exists in these leagues compared to the leagues right below them. So if you talk about the NFL or the NHL or the NBA being the premier league for those sports, the level of play just below those things has such a significant gap in the physical requirements to be able to basically survive in these leagues that I don't think that you are really ever going to see in any of those three sports a situation where a very talented female athlete is going to be able to break in and play in one of those leagues. And you think about, basketball, for example, the question is being brought up, hey, could Caitlin Clark last in the NBA? Well, I think you look at this season and you see how her body reacted to the rigors of the WNBA, and you go, well, no, it's a physical league in the WNBA, and that gets ramped up significantly for the obvious reasons when you go to the NBA. So, no, I don't think that you're going to see somebody be able to survive the NBA as a female athlete. Hockey and the NFL are the obvious there. I mean, you're talking about physical sports where, general violence is part of it. It's not just a byproduct of it. It is part of the games. Even a kicker at this point, as far as the NFL is concerned, I mean, these guys are starting to hit 68-yard field goals, right? Is there the physical capability for a woman to do that? And kicker is probably the only position in the sport where they might survive. And I guess if you want to align that with hockey, you'd probably be looking at a goalie. And I think for similar reasons, you just aren't going to see that. However, when it comes to baseball, I would argue that there really is nothing holding back a supremely talented female athlete at the game from breaking into the highest level of the sport when it comes to baseball. I mean, yes, you can make the argument that perhaps the power may not be there at the plate for them to crack home runs over 400-foot walls. But when you consider that the game is more than just that, when you consider that it's about defensive prowess, when it's about, being able to make certain pitches do certain things, right? There are opportunities, in my opinion. I think there is a world where you could see a female athlete with a level of talent that is great enough where professional baseball teams would take a serious look at utilizing them on their roster. And this kind of parlays into the WPBL in that the draft this week was held, as I mentioned, and the first overall pick was a woman by the name of Kelsey Whitmore. And if that name does not ring a bell for you, Kelsey Whitmore was a college baseball player at Cal State Fullerton, but after her career in college softball, she decided to give baseball a try. And she was able to make the roster for an independent professional baseball team, the Staten Island Ferry Hawks, out of the Atlantic League. And she became the first woman to play for that league. And that's a professional league. That is a professional baseball league. Yes, it's not associated with a Major League Baseball team. It's not part of the minor league system, but it is professional baseball. And she played that, and now, as of this season, she's part of the Savannah Bananas, which, okay, it's not professional baseball, but they're not taking hacks to go and do that. I mean, that's basically like playing for the Harlem Globetrotters. And so you look at Kelsey Whitmore, and you see somebody who got drafted first overall in this WPBL, obviously being somebody who was able to hang on with a professional baseball team, a professional male baseball team. Well, everybody else was male, is what I mean by that. And it's my point being made that there is the opportunity for women to break into baseball. It is a different game physically compared to the other three major American sports. And so then the question is, why do we need a league specifically for women? You know, is this going to be a product that is going to capture the attention of the American sports viewer when they already have a product in professional baseball? And generally speaking, American sports fans are only interested in the pinnacle of each sport. So when you think about the NFL versus the USFL or the AFL or all these USL, all these leagues that have popped up over the past decade or so, a lot, well, not a lot, all of them, except for the NFL, have struggled to maintain a foothold with the American public because people recognize that it is not the pinnacle of the game. And so while I understand the need to have an outlet, to have an opportunity for, women and girls to have something to look at and say, this is a path for me to continue to play. So you're talking about, girls that are playing baseball when they're at the youth level, and they look now and they say, well, there's a path. There's a professional league for me to play. I can see why that could be the argument for having a league like this. But looking at it the other way, what is stopping them from saying, well, if I'm good enough, I can make a major league roster? Arguably nothing. And so from that perspective, I challenge the notion that this was a necessary league. But then the other aspect of this, which I think is perhaps even more interesting when you consider growth of women's sports in general, is this league is now going head to head in terms of taking the best talent when it comes to baseball or softball with another upstart league as of this year, the AUSL. And the AUSL is Athletes Unlimited Softball League, which is the first professional women's softball league in the United States. And that also kicked off as of this year. And that league kind of has a flavor that is similar to the TGL in that you've got 4 teams that represent a grouping of players. They're playing head-to-head battles, and then they have kind of a playoff at the end of the year as well as a points-based all-star league that rounds out the season. So there's a little bit of creativity going on. It's not the softball that you would expect when you're talking about looking at college softball, but it is the premier professional league for softball. And now that you've got the AUSL and you've got the WPBL, you seemingly have 2 choices for the best collegiate softball players to consider when they're done playing college softball. And the reason I bring college softball up is because I look at college softball up until this year when the AUSL has existed, and I see that as the pinnacle of the sport of softball. So you'd ask somebody, well, why would I watch college softball? Why would I watch the Women's College World Series, for example? And my answer back to them would be, well, because you were watching the best that the game has to offer. There is no better than high-level collegiate softball. I mean, yes, there's international softball, but that doesn't come around every year. Every year, you have the Women's College World Series. You have the best players that are playing softball going head-to-head. And to me, that's worth watching. If you're watching the best, if you're watching the players that if there were a pro league would be in when they were eligible, that's something that the American sports fan historically has shown that they are willing to get behind. But now you have this situation where, and I read an article earlier in the week before the draft about Monet Davis. And Monet Davis, if you don't remember that name, in 2014, she was in the Little League World Series, was pitching for a team that was doing very well in that tournament, and she became a national sensation that summer. And the article that I read was an interesting one. It kind of detailed, where she had been since then. So it's been 10 years since, she was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And it talked about how while she really had a love for baseball, she didn't feel like there was an option for her to play. So she kind of settled into playing softball. And she ended up playing softball at Hampton College. And then after that was kind of looking at the situation saying, hey, is it time to hang up the cleats entirely? And this WPBL that is going to exist next year gave her kind of a new lease on baseball life, if you will. And, I look at this as just one example of, okay, you've got a player who was able to play college softball. They were obviously a very good baseball player at one point in their life, so they've played both, and seemingly they loved baseball more than they loved softball, but they felt like softball was their only option. How many cases of this actually exist? Are we making the argument that, as far as youth softball is concerned, that a significant portion of them would prefer to be playing baseball? I think in order for the WPBL to sustain itself, the answer to that would have to be yes. Otherwise, if you're, a girl playing softball at the youth level, why don't you just go play softball? You're going to get to play the premier level of the sport if you make it to high collegiate level. And then, at least at this point, there's a professional league afterwards that you potentially could funnel into as well. But with a women's professional baseball league also pulling kind of from the same pool of players, if you will, a lot of the people that got drafted in this week's draft are from the college softball ranks. You are essentially pitting yourself against high-level softball. So I could see a situation where the WPBL is actually cannibalizing a sport that, in my opinion, is possibly the only sport in existence where the women's game is the premier product. I can't think of another sport where people would look at it and say, yes, the women's side of this game is the premier product as far as the sport is concerned. Softball is definitely the case. There is no men's softball that people would prefer to watch over women's softball. There just isn't. And I think that's a unique situation when it comes to sports by gender. So I wish the WPBL luck. However, I'm curious how this is going to play out. Are they going to be able to get the support, one, from the American sports viewer? And number two, are they going to get the support from the pool of players? Are there enough young women out there that would prefer to play baseball over softball and feel like this path of taking an aim towards playing professional baseball over playing professional softball is a worthwhile endeavor? I'm really interested about listeners' comments on this. Hopefully you guys have a minute to take this in, think about it a little bit. Give me your comments. I'd like to understand, would you watch this product, number one? Number two, what is your thoughts about college softball? Do you agree with my thought about it being the premier product as far as that sport is concerned? But okay, I'll go ahead and I'll shift gears here a little bit. I mentioned that we're on week 2 now of Coach Speak 101 seemingly being thrown to the wolves, if you will. Last week it was Pat Narduzzi. I discussed that with Michael and his comments about losing the game to Notre Dame and how it would ultimately affect his team in terms of being able to get to their ultimate goal, which is the college football playoff. This week, we've got a coach that is effectively throwing his team under the bus in front of the national media, or in front of the media that he was speaking with, and saying that the team just basically isn't very good. So before I butcher this situation, John Sumrall, the head coach of Tulane this week, was asked about his team, and he gave very interesting comments related to where he thinks his team is at, given that they are ranked in the top 25 of the college football playoff rankings this week. And they are the only G5 team ranked in the top 25. But his comments were quite harsh. He addressing the question, said, "There's some days I feel we're in the bottom 25 teams in the country watching us play." And he went on to say, "There must be a lot of bad football going on if we're one of the top 25 teams." Further, he said, "We're average. We're an average team. We get either 6 or 7 days, depending on the schedule of the week, to promote ourselves and embarrass ourselves, and we've done that before. We better get ready to play. I watched us practice today. I think we're average." This is interesting because I've seen some people applaud Sumrall's comments and talk about how it's refreshing to see a coach be honest with the media about how he feels about his team rather than hiding behind the typical coach speak. In this situation, I'm not sure that I agree with that for a couple of reasons. Number one, you're talking about a team that is the only team in the G5 that is ranked. So effectively, Tulane controls its own destiny in terms of making the college football playoff. If they win out, they'll make it to the American Conference title game. If they win the American Conference title game, barring some unlikely situation where the committee decides to place another G5 team ahead of Tulane, whereas they're not doing so right now, Tulane is going to take the automatic berth allotted to a G5 conference champion, and they're going to head to the playoff. And so I don't really understand why you would make the comments, given the position that you're in, where you don't have control over what the committee does with your ranking, to call your team average. From one perspective, I can see Sumrall trying to use the comments to motivate his team, to try to get them focused so that they can accomplish the task at hand. And that's all well and good, but that's something that you've got to handle inside the locker room. Don't air that dirty laundry outside the locker room. The other point that I think is damaging, particularly to Sumrall's future prospects as a head coaching candidate for a larger job, is that if you're going to take this approach that you're going to disparage your team in the public, are you going to do that at a bigger program as well, when lobbying for your team and playing the political game when it comes to the rankings for the college football playoff is part of the role? Last week we talked about Sumrall as a potential candidate for SEC jobs like LSU and Auburn and maybe some others. And if you were to get that job, if you're Sumrall, you are absolutely going to have to play that game in the media where you are making a case for your team. It is not as simple if you are an SEC team vying for an at-large bid to simply let things play out. That type of mentality is reserved for the team or teams that have a direct path to a conference title game. But if you're in a situation, and there are teams in this situation in the SEC, for example, and some other conferences as well, where you do not control your own destiny to get into the playoff, but you still have a chance to get into the playoff, you are absolutely a politician for your team. And it is a little bit concerning, or if I were an AD of a program that maybe we're talking to somebody, I would see it as concerning that somebody would go the route of, instead of using this as an opportunity to promote a team in a situation where it would seemingly call for it, that you are using it as an opportunity to publicly motivate your team in a way that is better done inside of the four walls of the locker room. So I just find it interesting from Sumrall. I don't think anybody would argue that he's a guy who's not considering offers elsewhere. I think given what he has done at Tulane, he is absolutely a candidate for a larger job next year. And if we had to make a claim as to whether or not he would be at Tulane, I would say he's not going to be there for the 2026 season, that he would take this approach in the media with a team that, frankly speaking, has looked a little bit better than average for most of the season. Well, that's all I've got today. Just a couple of topics. Again, if you're interested in joining the conversation, send us a comment, send us a question, cornversationspod@gmail.com. Also, the comment sections on any of the listening platforms or our social media platforms are a good place to do that as well. We love that interaction. It's what keeps this show going. It's what keeps it evolving. So please consider that. Also, like and subscribe these shows as well. That really helps us in getting the word out. Hopefully everybody has a good weekend here coming up. There's a lot going on. Just 1 week from Thanksgiving. We will be back on Thanksgiving week. There's going to be another episode next week, so don't worry. There will be an opportunity to listen to us as you gather around the dinner table with family next week. But until then, enjoy the week ahead, and until next time, take it easy, Shuckers.